The first time we hear about the nomads in world history is in the 8th century BC when the Assyrians were busy carving out their empire in Western Asia. But instead of some desert tribe, we meet a people from far away called the Cimmerians who come thundering over the mountains and wastelands of the Eurasian steppe like a force of nature. In this video, we're going to learn about the Cimmerians, their successors, the Scythians and Sarmatians, and how these two nomadic peoples defined the ancient world. Let's get into it. As far as we can tell, the Cimmerians originated in the Eurasian steppes, somewhere around what is now southern Russia and Ukraine, although their exact location is a matter of debate among historians. First appearing in Near Eastern records in the 8th century BC, the Cimmerians are the earliest known steppe nomads that the ancient civilizations of the Near East had contact with. In the records of the Assyrians, they're described as coming from the north, raiding into lands like Assyria, Anatolia and Urartu. And while there's no surviving Cimmerian literature or records, the archaeological evidence shows us that they spoke a language isolate, meaning it wasn't related to any other known language, which isn't surprising given that we find them so far removed from any civilization. Their lack of writing also means that most of what we know about them comes from the biased accounts of their enemies. That said, one of the most famous descriptions of the Cimmerians was made by the Greek historian Herodotus, who described them as a ferocious people who loved war and were also tall, blonde and white-skinned. He described them as having round shields and helmets with horsetails sticking out of them. Wow, they rode horses into battle and shot arrows at their enemies, who would often run away because the Cimmerians were such fierce warriors, fearsome indeed. It seems that much of the ancient Near East knew about the Cimmerians, as they're mentioned in Egyptian, Babylonian and Elamite records. By the late 8th century, the Cimmerians were pushed south by another nomadic group called the Scythians, and they vanished from history soon thereafter. So not much is known about them, but their legacy lives on in the archaeology of the region. From around the 7th to 3rd centuries BC, we see the rise of the Scythians, whose influence reached further and lasted longer than that of their predecessors, the Cimmerians. In fact, the Scythians would go on to dominate the entire Eurasian steppe for a few centuries. Under their rule, hundreds of disparate tribes from around the Black Sea to Central Asia were incorporated into a vast confederation. Although originally just one of many tribes in the region, the Scythians went on to become one of the most well-known nomadic groups in all of ancient history. This success story started in the 7th century BC when the previously mentioned Cimmerians were forced south by another nomadic people. Archaeologists believe that these newcomers were part of the wider Scythian migration, which saw them expand east and west, conquering new lands and displacing the native populations. By the end of the 7th century, the Scythians had expanded as far west as the Balkans and as far east as Mongolia. However, during this period, the bulk of their territory was located somewhere around present-day Ukraine and southern Russia. But despite their vast domain, the Scythians were still very much a collection of tribes rather than a centralized state. This began to change in the 6th century BC when one Scythian leader named Spargapises united much of the northeast under his rule. He's sometimes called the King of the Scythians, though this title may have been more of an honorific than an accurate description of a centralized monarchy. Either way, his empire marked the high watermark of Scythian power. And afterwards, they were constantly on the defensive against a resurgent Persia and the growing power of the Greeks to the west. In spite of this, the Scythians retained their dominance on the northern shores of the Black Sea until the 3rd century BC, when they were finally supplanted by yet another nomadic group, the Sarmatians. The Scythians were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill as horsemen and their ability to live off the land. As pastoralists, they herded huge flocks of sheep, cattle and horses, which provided them with meat and hides. In addition, the mares of the steppes were noted for the quality of their milk, which could be turned into a tasty cheese that the Scythians enjoy eating. Furthermore, the fish of the rivers and lakes were plentiful and large, making fishing another easy source of food. The Scythians were also skilled hunters, taking down wild boars, deer and other game with their bows and arrows. In addition to providing sustenance, these activities also provided the Scythians with other useful materials like wool, leather, bone and wood. These nomadic groups usually lived in gairs, portable dwellings that could be easily assembled and disassembled, allowing for easy transportation. The gair consisted of a wooden frame covered with felt or leather, creating a circular or oval-shaped tent. Inside, the family's possessions were stored and meals were cooked and eaten. In addition, the Scythians kept their horses inside the ger at night for warmth, which also helped keep predators away. Speaking of which, since the ger was portable, the family could move it to a new location whenever they wanted, allowing them to follow herds of animals they depended on for food. Another notable aspect of Scythian culture was their burial practices. They built large burial mounds called kurgans over the graves of their elites, which were often filled with treasure. These burials provide us with a wealth of information about their culture, including their fondness for gold work and their skill as metalworkers. In addition, the Scythians left behind a number of artifacts that give us insight into their daily life, such as the famous Pasira carpet, which is one of the oldest surviving examples of its kind. Despite their impressive material culture, the Scythians were ultimately driven out of the steppes by the Sarmatians. So who exactly were the Sarmatians? Well, as far as we can tell, they were an Iranian-speaking people who emerged in the 3rd century BCE. Initially, they lived in relative obscurity, only appearing in sporadic conflicts with the Greeks and the rising power of Rome. Throughout the 2nd century BCE, they were in constant conflict with the Roman Republic, clashing with them along the Danube River. At first, the Romans struggled against the Sarmatians, but eventually, they began to incorporate Sarmatian cavalry units into their own army, which helped to develop the cavalry arm of the Roman military. Although the Sarmatians were often at war with Rome, they also engaged in trade with them and other societies, such as the Egyptians, where they sold slaves and horses. In addition, the Egyptian pharaohs purchased large numbers of Sarmatian women as wives for their royal court. In fact, Cleopatra VII had many Sarmatian lovers, and she even dressed her son in typically Sarmatian garb for a portrait bust. Throughout their long history, the Sarmatians were primarily horse-based. Just like the Scythians before them, they traveled, hunted and went to war on horseback and even slept while sitting on their horses' backs. Being a skilled rider was an essential part of their culture, and their skills were so renowned that the Romans would often hire them as mercenaries. They also fought with a sword and a shield and were known for their ability to endure extreme cold, which allowed them to thrive in the harsh environment of the Eurasian steppes. While the Sarmatians shared similarities with the Scythians, they also had their own unique customs and traditions. For example, they practiced a form of divination by examining the entrails of animals, and they believed that their souls could be transferred into animals upon death. They also had their own pantheon of gods, which included a supreme sky god and a goddess of the earth and fertility. Unfortunately, since the Sarmatians were mostly an oral society, little is known about their religion. Nevertheless, the remains of their burials reveal much about their beliefs, showing that they buried their dead with their favorite possessions, including horses, chariots, and weapons. They were also known for their skill in metalwork, and their artifacts are often found decorated with intricate designs of animals and plants. In addition to their religious beliefs and artistic achievements, the Sarmatians were also known for their military prowess. They were a fierce and disciplined fighting force, and their cavalry was particularly formidable. They fought against the Roman Empire for centuries, and their resistance was only broken in the late 4th century AD, when they were conquered by the Huns. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Huns and the remnants of the Sarmatians migrated westward and established new homes across Europe. Some scholars even claim that the legendary Germanic warrior queen, the Brunhild, was actually a Sarmatian princess. This blend of various nomadic cultures led to a fascinating exchange of goods, ideas, and customs between Europe and Asia. The silk produced in China found its way to the west through the Central Asian steppes, while horses from the Pontic-Caspian steppe traveled east, changing the course of history. Without these exchanges, the great empires of antiquity might have looked very different. Unfortunately, very little written information survives from these early nomads. Most of what we know about them comes from the writings of their enemies, such as the Greeks and Romans. And as we already discussed, these accounts are often biased and sometimes exaggerated for dramatic effect. In addition, many of the archaeological sites associated with these nomads have been lost or destroyed due to human activity or natural disasters. Despite these challenges, archaeologists have made significant progress in piecing together the story of these early nomads and their impact on the ancient world. For example, The discovery of the Paziric tombs in the 20th century has provided invaluable insights into the culture and lifestyle of the Scythians. These discoveries have helped to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions that have long surrounded these nomadic groups and have revealed the richness and complexity of their cultures. Further research and exploration will no doubt continue to shed light on these fascinating peoples and their lasting impact on history. Thank you so much for watching. It's been my pleasure to guide you through the stories of the Cimmerians, Scythians and Sarmatians, these enigmatic nomadic groups whose influence on the ancient world was profound despite their elusive nature. If you found this journey through time intriguing, I invite you to subscribe for more historical adventures and join me in exploring the rich tapestry of our past. Until then, farewell and may your own journeys be filled with wonder and discovery.